Mipanza sango botika tango nazalaki na ndako baboti na mona kabilote botika ngai tovanda o na sheri a kitoko ekotanga mafuta ya nzoyo na mwindo ya wenge nyongo ya lamoro amemisa ngai o na bosana liwa na mokili azokisi mosisa ya molema o natangisi ma ya miso na plaisir papa sheri a papa ya bana na ngai mobali nanga bandeko sheri a mon cœur est blessé.
All right, no mai, haere mai. So look, welcome everyone. Before I introduce myself, I'm chair and also the first speaker. I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to process this. So basically we've got 3 in-person speakers and we've got someone virtually as well. And so what we're going to do is deal with the in-person speakers first so that we can then have the virtual speaker stay up on the screen as well and participate in those questions and answers as well. And I think to keep to time, what we'll do is have everyone do their presentations first and then we'll have some questions and answers at the end. So a couple of us might have a little bit of shorter presentations, but it'll provide an opportunity for everyone to have a discussion. But what I will do is introduce each speaker as they look to come up, who are very nicely sitting at the front. So thanks, guys. Anyway, so look, welcome everyone. This session is actually calling Perspectives Power People Navigating Alternatives to Development. And as Dean and I were saying, it looks like we might have been people who've been kind of popped into a similar session together. But we're obviously talking, it seems, from a similar kaupapa. And so I'll just wait for my presentation to come up, but just to locate myself. So ko wao, iti taha o tukupapa, ko taranaki ti mauna, ko tokomaru ti waka, ko waitra ti awa, ko tiati awa ti iwi, ko ngati rahiri ti hapu, ko awai ti marae, ko Stewart rātou, ko Hollis, ko Larson, ko Friend, oku ingoa whānau, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So I've just basically located myself in terms of my whakapapa, in terms of Te Atiawa, which is in the Taranaki. Great, thank you. So just to kind of introduce my presentation, I'm talking about Māori mahi, Māori ora, and I'm talking about measuring success, Indigenous understandings of M&E in sport for development. And so just a little bit of a recap of this and an outline of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the genealogy to this project, so the whakapapa. I'm going to talk about this place of belonging, so locating the presentation as well. Some principles that have come out of a paper that my colleagues and myself developed. I'm going to talk about this notion of wayfinding. So it was really interesting that our talker, speaker in the last session actually talked about this notion of wayfinding. And then I've got a little exercise I want people to do if there's enough time. Otherwise, we can do this in the question and answer sessions. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about drawing on a few findings from some initial work that we've done, notions of its success in terms of M&E, and so thinking about what this might mean for sport for development initiatives. So for 20 plus years of dedicated sport for development theorisation, research, practice, we've seen this real significant growth and sophistication, but Indigenous voices within this theorisation, policy practice actually still remain underrepresented. And this is quite disturbing, given that Indigenous populations are frequently the focus of sport for development initiatives, and we know that when outcomes are better when the design of these projects and the way that they're implemented actually reflect Indigenous aspirations. And so we also know that when these sorts of initiatives are not informed by ideas from Indigenous populations, they can actually hinder Indigenous progress as well. And so this might be the case when project or program goals and impact and outcome measures lack alignment with Indigenous aspirations and measures of success. And I'm going to try and give some examples from fieldwork about what success has looked like for Indigenous people in this project. And so success, for example, might be about the idea that people can use ancestral language, inclusion, and that might be a better measure of whether the project has been successful or not, or it might be whether the initiative can work really nicely alongside an Indigenous kind of festival or ceremony, something like that. So that might be a better measure of success. So the whakapapa to this project really came out of the idea that my colleagues and I tried to submit a article to a special issue back in about 2018, and when we went to pick our keywords for our submission, we couldn't choose post-colonial and we couldn't choose Indigenous. And so we were like, what? So we did a search of the journal, and you can see on the screen in front of you that actually there had only been something like from 2011 was the first mention through to 2017, and there were only 16 articles in this top-tier A-ranked journal in terms of references to Indigenous populations. And so what we did was then we reached out to the editors of the special of this issue, and we kind of said, look, you know, we'd be really interested in floating this idea of a special issue. We'd like to re-theorise the space around Indigenous sport for development. And initially the editor came back and he said, it seems like a good idea. I'll reach out to my editorial committee. And then he kind of came back to us and he said, well, and not exactly in these words, but basically he said, we're not really sure that anyone would be interested, and we're not really sure that the quality of what would be produced would be good enough for our journal. And so this is in 2018 was this narrative that came through. The really good thing was that this motivated us hugely. So not only did the work get published in terms of the article, we've got a special issue that's about to come out in the Journal of Sport for Development with the foreword being written by Linda Smith and Graham Smith, and it also became the basis of a Marsden project. And so good things can come out of, you know, not so great stuff. And so this is kind of the basis of this project. So, really thankful to that editorial team for thinking that no one would be interested, and Indigenous people probably weren't clever enough to be able to do a good job. Anyway, so ended up winning this kind of Marsden project, and it's called Our Game by Our Rules, bringing in an Indigenous perspective to the sport for development field. Okay, so 3 concerns underpin this project. That firstly, Indigenous worldviews and ways of being and doing, especially women's views, are silenced or positioned at the margins in many disciplines, including sport for development. Sport for development agendas by nature are inherently deficit-focused because they tend to focus on a problem. So they're looking at low literacy or youth crime or things like that. And Indigenous people often bear the brunt of this lens when they're targeted by deficit-focused sport for development initiatives. And we also kind of want to build on a tradition of Indigenous arguments that challenge those deficit views. And then the other thing that we're kind of thinking about is that initiatives tend to overlook community members as knowledge sources when looking at the world of evidence and decision making. And in community members, their knowledge and evidence is often excluded when determining what success looks like, with M&E indicators drawing on mainly external top-down measures. And we've heard a lot about that over this conference as well. The one point I do want to make is just because an Indigenous person might say something, it doesn't mean that it's Indigenous knowledge. And so we also need to be quite clear about some of that stuff as well. Okay, so in the paper that we published in 2019, we identified a couple of principles that we believe can underpin sport for development initiatives for Indigenous people. And we looked a lot at what people were saying, and there seemed to be some commonalities regardless of the cultural context. So people very much talked about this idea of perspective. So, thinking about this kind of place in the world and thinking about this from a philosophical positionality, thinking about this idea of privilege, so taking into account ways of knowing, doing, being, those sorts of things. Politics, it's absolutely a political struggle when you're thinking about resistance, autonomy, self-determination, all of those things. This idea of protection when we're thinking about things like, guardianship, cultural humility, reclaiming this right to have a voice, etc., etc. And then people, acknowledging this idea of past, present, and future. So this is all stuff that we're talking about lots in this conference, and it's stuff that won't be unfamiliar to people. So we also have this concept, so this is this notion of wayfinding, so talking about the orientation, the implementation of values, human dynamics, deepening practices, and exploring and discovering kind of new destinations. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's this fabulous paper from 2019 that everyone could read. Anyway. And then we also look about this, so if I think about what does that waka look like in relation to the wayfinding framework. So the whole waka, a needle or compass guiding principles. The hull of the waka is about the guiding values. The rudder, mast, sails, those sorts of things is about identity, self-knowledge, alignment, collective well-being, those sorts of things. And we go on in terms of defining. So I'm now going to talk to some of our initial findings from the conversations that we've started to have with people. So obviously COVID's delayed the project somewhat, and also what it's done is that it's made our ability to actually spend time in communities and go back to communities more difficult. Communities are actually busy dealing with COVID, those sorts of things. Elderly people are needing protection in terms of their health and stuff like that. So things haven't necessarily progressed at a speed in which we kind of hope they will. But we're really hopeful about next year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what success is not, for example. So quote from the field, and I haven't attributed these to anyone specifically, mainly because we're in the early stages of presenting this information. So one of the things that it's not, so this idea of percent of attendance, and we've heard a little bit about this today as well. So it's not how many percent of people attend. It's not about getting fit instead of fat. It's not about how many boys versus girls come, how many stayed on till the end, whether they win the game. The idea that X can suddenly catch a ball, kick a ball, or the ball doesn't get destroyed by the kids, or the dads let the girls come too. So these are the things that programs measure without a doubt. Gender, how many people came along, what are the skills that people go away with, that sort of stuff. But one of the things people also think about is this idea that the percent often looks at the individual person. It's an individual appraisal and how many people did this and how many people did that and how well did they do that stuff. But one of the things people were starting to talk about is, okay, well, which we heard throughout the conference as well, what matters most to this community, what is most meaningful to this community, and then actually seeing how does this initiative enable what is most meaningful, what matters to this community. So when we're thinking about ideas of success, one of the points I also want to make is that, counting and measuring stuff is still important. Indigenous people have always counted, they've always quantified, and they've always measured. That's how they navigated, that's how they thought about astronomy, that's how they planted, that's how they cared for the environment. So numbers still matter. We're not saying that numbers don't matter, but it's also about the other stuff that's really important. So about those relational connections. And a lot of people have talked about the VAR, about the relationship, and looking at the relationship and the dimensions, and looking at the relationship between the dimensions. Okay. So here's some of the statements that have kind of out of the community in terms of what does success look like. And I think some of these could actually be applied to any kind of initiatives as well, not just sport for development initiatives. So the community is interested to look on and they look on positively. So they want to look on. The elders feel valued and respected by the project people. Links are made to the old ways or people by facilitators, and the kids can remember what is told to them. So it's not, do you remember how to hold a cricket bat? Can you remember what someone told you about your ancestors as a better measure of success? Kids show more confidence to do a pepe haran te reo. So the idea that I can stand up the front and I can use my own language to talk about myself shows a level of confidence. That's a great measure of success. Integration of cultural artefacts or processes are a part of the day-to-day functioning of the program. So it's just normalised, the idea that actually everyone knows that there's a karakia before kai, or everyone knows that we start something by kind of locating ourselves in the land and thinking about our connections to the different realms. Connections are made to land, connections are made to the non-human and the human. It's good fun. Connections are made to spiritual elements. People talk about we sing, we tell stories, people want you back. The community can name you and feel like they know you. People want to feed you. They want to nourish you. Relationships get stronger, they feel stronger. People talk about the program, they say good things, and people share themselves and want to take what they know and tell others in the community. So they're taking what's being learned here and they want to share it with other people. So I've got a couple of quotes which we've just quickly pulled out from some of the work we've recently done. So if you ask the kids what did they like best about the program, they hardly ever say, I like this game or that game, or I have this new skill or that skill. What they say best is their families looked on. What they like best is the community yells for them. When the family doesn't look on and the community doesn't make a noise, then ask yourself, what was good about what you did? And this one I really like here, actually. Sure, the kids will have a big smile from scoring a goal, but they have a bigger smile when they can talk about their ancestors, when they can stand up in front of their mates and talk about their genealogy and use the right words. That's an indicator, the size of the smile. So maybe we should be like measuring people's smiles as an indication of success. Another quote, I don't really remember too much about what we did each week. I just remember when we came to play, I felt proud. I felt happy to be from the kura. I felt like a warrior. I no longer felt ashamed about where I came from. We are no longer the poor club with the poor kids. We are the warriors. So another idea of kind of success is when you don't look at me like I am the problem, this is success. Okay, so what we're talking about a little bit here is M&E should be celebrating all that Indigenous people have done and do and will do. And so, yeah, people talked about the idea that maybe M&E yourself, ask the question, what was the experience like for you as the practitioner? If it wasn't great, then you probably missed the mark. It should be good for you too. Okay, so I'll stop there. So we're at the really early stages of this. So the next step from here is that we're actually going out to about 150 sport for development organisations around the globe who appear to or quite openly work with Indigenous populations to look at how they design, implement and evaluate their programs. Some of them will come quite clearly from an Indigenous kaupapa or an Indigenous worldview. Others will just be working with Indigenous populations and not necessarily come from a worldview. We've ended up with a kind of cohort of groups that are working in Canada, working in Latin America, working in New Zealand, working in Australia, working in various countries in the global south as well. And so we've ended up being able to kind of mine from Instagram and Facebook all of these organisations that are actually doing really cool work with Indigenous populations using sport as a vehicle for this development. So hopefully from this we'll be able to ascertain really well, you know, what does it mean to design and implement a program that might sit on this end of the spectrum that's coming from an Indigenous kaupapa doing this work, or someone that's kind of more on this end of the spectrum that's working with Indigenous populations who are often the target of these initiatives, but might be coming from a different kind of perspective as well. So maybe in 2 years I'll have more to say. Anyway, questions at the end. Right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move us on to our next speaker, and speakers maybe don't do what I do and move around a lot, but yeah, good sound here and good visuals here. But I'm just going to introduce now Dr. Dean Strong. So Dean is with Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. He's an environmental social science researcher for Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research and Aotearoa New Zealand Crown Institute, and he's based in Hamilton. His research interests include livelihoods, invasive species, wellbeing, social license to operate, social practice theory, and social and environmental justice. So big round of applause for Dean.
Hang on, just before you take off, which one?
Yeah, sorry.
Up and down.
Yeah.
All right.
And
cool.
then shine the light.
Yeah, shine the light.
Yeah.
All right. I don't need the light. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko taranaki tōku maunga, ko punihu tūku o awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā me te Aotearoa uku iwi, ko Dean Strong tūku ingoa. Ke kere rawa aiha e noho ana, ki Manaaki Whenua aiha e mahe ana. Nā reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So, this presentation is about being manahere, or arriving with care, and I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Alison, who's hiding up the back, and Nick, who's swanning somewhere in overseas. So this is... Oh, sorry. I keep wandering. So this is work in progress. As we will outline in the background of the work, it has been developed over a long period of time, but we are still very much at the beginning of the process. Another thing I'll point out is a common theme that has come out of the sessions that I've attended anyway over the last 2 days, that there's the need for Pākehā to reflect on their role in the colonisation process, and I think this talk fits well within that sentiment. So, background. Outline of the talk will cover some background of the concept, talk about the resources that have been developed. We'll talk about the application, including the challenges and the opportunities, and we'll finish off with some what we think might be some potential for wider development. So manahere is translated into English as guests or visitors, with reference to values and etiquette associated with arrival at a marae or a new place. So the term is used as gifted in Te Kawa o Te Urewera, a seminal publication outlining the vision of the management of Te Urewera. The Being Manahere research developed from the process surrounding the establishment of the Te Urewera Act in 2014, which established Te Urewera as an independent legal identity. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Te Urewera, it's a remote, rugged area of hill country in the east of the North Island, and is central to the well-being of Ngā Tūhoi. From 1954 through to about 2014, much of that area was designated as a national park and administered by the Department of Conservation. As part of the process of establishing the Act in 2012, Te Koutahia Tūhoi engaged Manaaki Whenua to hold a summit among non-Tūhoi stakeholder groups with connections to the national park. And in preparation for a second summit in 2020, members of 14 manahere groups were interviewed to review how that relationship had grown. The second summit was held in January 2020, and attended by 40 people from Manahere groups, and including Te Urewera board members and members of the Department of Conservation. The workshops about being Manahere, additional workshops about being Manahere, one with environment and recreation groups in Wellington, and 3 online with research colleagues who also held as part of this research. So that's sort of the background as to where it came from. So informed by those insights and interviews and the workshops, the Arriving with Care discussion resources were co-developed with colleagues as well as the artist Carol Green. So this particular resource was developed for environment and recreation groups who have an interest in areas that are now managed by Māori organisations and government agencies. And the resource provides a scenario to initiate discussion and reflection for environment and recreational groups as they discuss and develop their understandings and practices for being responsible Manahere. So the scenario in the Arriving with Care discussion resource tells the story of Doug, who's the leader of a tramping group and whose favourite tramping spot has become co-managed with iwi and tapu. So the scenario outlines the steps that Doug takes to foster appropriate relationships with tangata whenua, and through the story promotes and provides for discussion. The resources and the aims, the story and prompts provide for discussion around the aims that help them reflect on what it means to be responsible Manahere and how to best prepare to arrive with care and respect for those places and the people there. So the resource was created for use in a facilitated workshop situation, and it's the discussion resource is primarily focused at Pākehā, for Pākehā or Tāiwi, and it's about reflecting on positionality and decolonisation. For non-Māori, learning how to be Manahere in environment and co-management and co-governance arrangements is going to be essential to build those long-term reciprocal relationships with Runanga and iwi. So there will be opportunities and challenges for non-Māori in learning to be Manahere. One of the challenges requires discussions and reflections on white privilege. It requires discussions and reflection on colonisation, racism, many of which all of these really are very sensitive subjects for most Pākehā. So how we work with this material is going to be key. So given its sensitive nature, we're looking to workshop it with organisations who realise that they want to have these conversations. So we're taking it slowly at this stage and being cautious and fostering those invitations, because we know you can't force those conversations. So while we were hoping to have had a workshop by now, that's yet to happen, but we have some lined up, and potentially we have conversations ongoing around that. But there's also opportunities, obviously. There will be, collaborative management creates new opportunities for recreation and environment groups to be involved in the care of the places they visit, creating opportunities for shared responsibility and more mutual understanding of those places. So that particular resource was developed for use with recreational groups, and while we're still in the early stages of applying this work, we also see the potential for its wider applications beyond that recreational space. So we are aware of a number of blogs, commentaries, papers, etc., that discuss how aid and development research has been undertaken and the need to decolonise it and do it differently. And we think there is potential for the concept of arriving with care to be developed into another tool to assist with this process. Our thinking around this is still very embryonic, but we envision a range of different scenarios that could potentially be connected to an induction or an ethics process. But the scenarios used to help people reflect on their positionality before engaging with the development projects. Very early thoughts at the moment, but we're happy to collaborate with anybody who sees merit in this. So thanks to a few people, and we'll leave it there.
Great, thank you for that, Dean, and really nice to see your institutions taking, I suppose, responsibility and lead. And there is quite a bit of discussion in this space around the idea of not only calling out but calling in, so that we can actually shift people along together as well. All right, so I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, and then we'll move to following this, to our virtual speaker. So I'd just like to welcome Jerry Stewart. So Jeremy's from the Solomon Islands National University. So welcome, Jerry. So he's going to be talking about logging versus alternative development in the Solomon Islands. And so Jerry is a senior lecturer for management, public administration and entrepreneurship with the Solomon Islands National University. In May 2022, he graduated from the University of South Pacific with a Doctor of Philosophy in Governance. Well, that deserves a clap anyway, right? Yeah. Good on you. Most of us know how hard it is to do a PhD, and some of us are going to learn. Up to you, Jerry.
Thank you so much. Hello, Oketa. Okay. Okay, my topic today is going to be logging versus alternative development in Solomon Islands. I think yesterday I sat here and listened to some presentations about SDG implementation. This will be a perfect example of challenges of implementing SDGs on a local level in a country such as Solomon Islands. Okay, so my main contribution to the session will be on the perspectives of Solomon Islanders on development, how they define development, and why the definition of development affects the choices they make with regards to allowing the land for development. So we have the content. We will be exploring some different economic areas of Solomon Islands just to set the perspective for the presentation. And then we'll explore the Solomon Island perspective of development, as well as the main topic, which is the why is logging taking precedence over conserving. Conserving is used as an example of alternative development that could occur, rather than logging as. I don't know if most of you know about the Solomon Islands, but it's regarded by most academics as being a largely logging economy. The dependence of the economy on logging. So this is what the main substance will be, and then we will conclude for the session. Okay, conservation efforts have drastically increased in recent years, and that is in response to increased logging activities in the Solomon Islands. The effort was mostly by NGOs with somewhat limited support from the national government. For instance, this community here is Sierra Bay tribe. I think just this year, they've achieved carbon trading status under the Protected Area Act. And so now they will be receiving like around $1 million Solomon dollars per year just for carbon trading and conserving their land. And so projects such as carbon trading become an attractive income for rural Solomon Islanders. But then, unfortunately, logging remains still the number one earner for the country. Like for the first quarter, Central Bank of Solomon Islands report on earnings, logging still accounts for 15% of government revenue, 60% of exports, and 35% of the exchange rate. So just during the COVID-19 situation in the first quarter, the logging has already earned like 42 million US dollars for the country, whereas the closest was tuna, which is 8 million US dollars. So that is how the country is very much relying on the logging for its economy. Now, for those of you who do not know Solomon Islands, sorry, due to time constraint, I won't be able to tell you much about the Solomons, but yeah, these Solomon Islands, it's like around 28,000 kilometers, square kilometers of land. It's dispersed. Like we have like 6 main islands, and only 30% of the land is urban. So much of the land is 70% of the land is still in the rural areas. So development, donors when they come, and every activity is very much centralized on the 30% of the land, and 70% of the land is still undeveloped, and people still live mostly, and they survive mostly on subsistence means, and they do not have much economic prospects that could enhance their livelihood. And this is the bottom line for this presentation. Okay, before I take it to the findings of one of our research, I was part of a 3-man team that we did a political economy study of natural resource management. The study was conducted in conservation communities in Solomon Islands in 3 provinces, mainly, I don't know, how do I use mainly in Malaita, Guadalcanal, and the Western Province, as well as interviewing some government officials from the government, and we did interview some NGOs as well, like Live and Land, and then also some prominent people who were involved in the political arena, as well as in the logging activity over the past years. So before I take you there, I think it will be nice to talk about the different economic eras that Solomon Islanders went through, just to give a picture of how and why Solomon Islanders perceive development as they do now. So if we are to go back in time to the traditional Solomon Islands, the governance was very much centered on a big man system, or what I would like to call a traditional barter system economy. That is, the big man economy exists in pockets of tribal groups, and is not communal or provincial in nature. The political, social, and economical standards revolve around the big man, or in some matrilineal societies, big woman as well. The big man or the big woman is similar to the president, the prime minister. They are the administrator, they are the law, and they are the religion. And that is how the traditional Solomon Islands was. So you would know, there would be pockets of groups with different leaders, and it's not like everyone under one, unlike the Polynesians, or where you have the chiefly system. The Solomon Islands, and I think the Melanesian countries, they revolved around this system in the olden days. Then came the Europeans during the exploration stage, which took the barter system to a next level, where the indigenous were trading their resources, like potato, livestock, water for European goods such as mirrors, tobacco, alcohol, even guns for warfare. And then during the colonial days, with the introduction of modern governance system, the people were then introduced to the caste economy, which means there exists a standard medium to purchase goods or services. Now, in the latter years of the colonial period, there was the introduction of the logging economy by the British. But this was at that time done on government-owned lands. But after independence, local governments started moving logging into the customary owned lands. And at 45 years of age, logging, unfortunately, is still the major contributor to the national economy. And then recently, with the introduction of extractive industries such as gold, bauxite, nickel, there is a danger of over-relying on extractive industries, and with no motivation to develop other industries which are much more sustainable. Now, why I'm sharing this is because the economists discuss reveals how Solomon Islanders define development. So Solomon Islanders' perspectives on development. Now, development for the majority of people in the Solomons is the assistance with immediate benefit, and not long-term outcome. For instance, if you help a person to replace their leaf house, what we call leaf house, that's sagopam house, replacing it with permanent iron roofing houses, they call that development. Or if you provide school fee for a person, for the children, they call that, they perceive that as development. And hence the Rural Constituency Development Fund, which is, I think, famous among the academics, is quite famous because if you do that, a person will be loyal to you, and it is a major influencer of election outcomes during election period. Or then trading of resources for immediate cuts. And then there is still the cargo cult mentality of someone will come and help us. And so you can imagine the perceptions of development goes against other noble initiatives such as conservation or even other noble preservation of natural resources, which is not considered as development. And so we come back to the main research question, which is why is logging taking precedence over conservation? So based on the responses from the respondents, we put it into themes. And remember, this is a part of a much bigger study. So I'm just, for interest of time, I'm just presenting just a little bit here. So we have the misinterpretation of community governance, poverty of opportunities, mishaps of national governance, and failures of national compliance as the main reasons why other development initiatives are not taking root, and logging is still the #1 earner for the country. Now, going back to the introduction, you would have noted that logging shifted from government-owned lands into customary-owned lands. Now, in the Solomons, the tribes own lands, and there is a big distinction between a tribe and a community. A community is a combination of different tribes who came to live at one location because of religious affiliations, or during the colonial period, they were moved to one location for ease of colonial administration. So they do not necessarily own land. So you would remember that I said 30% of land is owned by the government and 70% by the tribe. So 70% of land in the Solomons is not owned by the government, it is owned by the tribes. So the government doesn't have any say within that 70% of land. So when initiatives such as conservation or other reforms came, when driven to the community level, it is bound to be unsuccessful if you focus on the community, because they do not own the land and they do not have authority over the land. And most conservation initiatives often preach only at the 30% of urban areas. They do not go as far as the village level, the 70%. So people down there would not know what is going on up there. They wouldn't know about conservation. They wouldn't know about maybe other reforms such as gender mainstreaming and so forth. And so because of that, the people are left in the dark, and they are vulnerable to loggers or those people who want to mine, because when they came knocking on the door with no other opportunities, they'll just jump on whoever comes first. Oh, okay. Poverty of opportunities. And poverty of opportunities in these states is the lack of economic activities in the rural areas for rural people to earn steady income. So because of this, there is the tendency for people to look for quick money. There are those who said that the lack of access to public services and economic activities prompted tribal people to accept logging, as well as the hierarchy of needs. You know, most of the people in the 70% of the land I was alluding to earlier, most of them are subsistence people. They did not earn money because of no jobs or job opportunities, and they involved in subsistence farming. They sell the products when they can, but there is no steady market where people can sell the products every day. So there is the abundance of resources, but they can't convert those resources into cash because of no market. And you can imagine during the COVID-19 what that is like for most of the people in the rural areas. And so yeah, that links to lack of economic prospects as well. And then this thing seems to be going opposite. Sorry about that. And then the mishaps of national governance. There is a general consensus from most of the respondents that one of the main reasons why conservation and protected area initiatives do not take root is due to the people's lack of understanding of concepts. Like for instance, if you say conservation or you say SDGs to the people down there, they wouldn't understand. They wouldn't understand those concepts because of literacy level is low, and the people wouldn't have much. What would I say? Much. 2 minutes. Sorry. Exposure to such items. So that is one of the. And then this harmony of laws, national laws in the country is still not complementing each other or are enforced in silo. For like Department of Environment, they're mandated to protect the environment. However, they're also giving approvals for logging as well. So the legal system, which is supposed to be protector of citizens and their properties, is not forthcoming or ineffective. One of the shortcomings very evident is the government's infrastructure reach or the resource capacity to fully implement its laws. And then there is the obvious case of corruption, which has manifested itself in all fabrics of society, and such gap allows logging industry to thrive in such circumstance. And then finally, the failures of failures of national compliance. Whilst laws are in existence, the government's ability to enforce is very weak due to a lot of factors. And then even monitoring, similar with enforcement, the government's weak infrastructure reach means it is unable to monitor development consents it granted for logging operations. And the lack of enforcement and monitoring is a weak area that must be improved if we're to see Conservation and Protected Area Act enforced, and that goes for other development initiatives as well. So finally, some policy options as a means of conclusion. So for any development to occur in such context as the Solomons, you have to understand the land tenure system. The land tenure system, it cannot be changed. It is what it is, and people are tied to the land due to cultural means. So for development to occur, it doesn't mean you just go to Honiara or you just go to the 30% of the urban areas. It has to go right down to the village level, to the people who own the land, and then such initiatives will take root. And then for that to happen, you have to, the government have to recognize the landowners by decentralizing economic opportunities so that it can boost their livelihood and then allow them to participate and contribute to the economy. And then there is the politics of scale, which occurs for the government as well as even donors and other NGOs. When they come, they focus on the urban centers, and they forget about the 70% of the people at the rural level who own the land. I think that is all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Jerry. I'm sure there'll be some questions once we hear our final speaker. So just moving now to our final speaker, we've got Brian Alofa Ituli, who's coming in from the National University of Samoa, and he's going to be talking about how Samoa navigated through troubled waters. So Brian is a senior lecturer and head of Department of Development Studies, the Pacific Islands at the National University of Samoa. Received his PhD in history from the University of Hawaii. His research interests are religion and development, Pacific church history, empire migration, and cultural heritage. So welcome, Brian, and we can see your presentation up on screen, so we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. This particular research is an ongoing research. I do have a history background, but development studies is fairly new. For Lau Marfatu, how Samoa navigated through troubled waters. Just a very brief background. Samoa's islands obviously are in the Pacific, the South Pacific region. For centuries have been occupied and ruled by chiefly authority for centuries, and even till this day, obviously modernization and globalization has changed what that sounds like and looks like, but it's still in power. The Samoa, as cultural protocols and the ways of life are actually still intact, but obviously they've changed with globalization. And like in any society, culture changes and evolves, and culture is dynamic. Very briefly, Samoa, the western islands of Samoa were occupied by the Germans from 1900 to 1914. From 1914 to 1916, 62 rather, occupied by New Zealand, and then became the first country in the Pacific to gain its independence in 1962 to present. This year, we celebrated 60 years of independence here in Samoa. Development of Samoa, very briefly, looking at the political, economic, or the social, sports, arts, and media. And basically what the emphasis of this particular ongoing research is, and this is the beginning stages of this particular research, is looking at the role of Christianity. Basically looking at the entanglement of Christianity as the major religious denomination here in the islands of Samoa and American Samoa to the east, whether it's political, economic, social, sports, arts, media, in all aspects, tradition and modernity are not polar opposites. However, within this particular society, and it's a study that I'm interested in looking at further, it's looking at how traditions are supporting modernity, however, at its own pace. The case study that I'm looking at in today's presentation is looking at the role of Christianity in the overall constitutional crisis, or the political crisis of 2021. And just to put some context to what's going on during this particular case study. The general elections of 2021, the Human Rights and Protection Party, the HRPP, were in power for 30 years. In the year 2019, there was a particular law that was brought in before Parliament to challenge the role of the Land and Titles Court, basically removing the power of the Supreme Court in making decisions within the Land and Titles Court. For that particular reason, many parliamentarians removed themselves from the HRPP party and formed the FAST party, the Fatuatua Iliatua Watasi, in 2020. Fiumem Ta'afa, who is the current Prime Minister of Samoa, was one of the main leaders of the HRPP at the time, and she removed herself for those particular reasons. She thought that the Land and Title Court bill was being rushed, that the constituencies around Samoa were not being addressed or hearing the issues. And even Samoans who are living in New Zealand and Australia, they wanted to make sure that the Supreme Court would continue to keep the Land and Titles Court in check, if you will, or keep them accountable. Then it leads us to the actual election of 2021. As the newly formed political party at this time in 2020, they actually go head-to-head with the HRPP, and 26 parliamentarians to 26 parliamentarians. And actually there was one more who was an independent who actually broke that particular tie, High Chief Paeni Mutuala. He was independent. He chose then to go to the side of the HRP, the FAST. As a result of this particular outcome of 26 HRPP to 27, the head of state of Samoa, Tui Malifano, actually declared FAST party as the actual winners of the 2021 general elections. However, 2 days later, the head of state revoked his initial statement and basically pulled it. And that became very controversial in Samoan society. We're basically questioning who has the rights to do this, what does the Constitution say? And basically, at that particular reason why he removed the revoked his initial statement was HRPP challenged this particular decision because of a 2013 parliamentary bill that was passed that you need a 10% quota of women. In looking at development, and looking in how Samoa was wanting to become, making sure that we are being up to par with many of the changes in terms of gender. In 2013, they made that change. So the HRPP at this particular time said that we didn't have a 10% women gender representation in this particular election. So it went before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court eventually overturned the head of state's proclamation, but then it moved fast. The FAST Party moved forward to swear in. HRPP were not present. And in the look of the world, this was basically what the world was saying, and even in Samoa, calling it a constitutional crisis, that Samoa is resolving Samoa's democratic crisis. This becomes the terminology that is used. But this particular research that I'm looking at, and even looking at how Samoa dealt with it, religion played a very important role, but not only religion in general, but the concepts of Christianity. Now, obviously, I'm involved in the church and I'm an insider in this, but you can see that looking at development and looking at Christianity is obviously part of every aspect of society. If you live here or even if you study these particular islands, scholars and missiologists such as Foreman and even Tomlinson mentioned that in order to understand Samoa, you have to understand Christianity. And this particular research is basically looking at how Christianity dealt and was able to bring peace during this particular point. Tiamea then addresses this and basically says that Samoa is a maturing democracy. She admits that it tested the pillars of our society, our faith, our culture, and the rule of law. But then she states that we maintain that our Christian values, unique culture, and traditions complement our human rights obligation and fundamental freedoms. And then she also mentions that cultural or religious solutions can solve the current political crisis. Yes, she also admits that there was a crisis, but this wasn't, we cannot compare this to other societies around the world. And we could actually say that Christianity, or the practice of and how Christianity has infiltrated its every aspect of Samoan society, actually was a factor of bringing peace during this particular political period. These are some points to kind of sum up what I'm looking at. Christianity development or governance are not two separate spheres. And then Christianity and the concepts here, or the context of Samoa, is looking at Christianity as a phenomenon. It is within every system of the government, but understanding how did that start about, we can look at the Max Weber Protestant ethic and looking at if that actually applies here, and challenging modernity or the modernization theory of it's not always about secularization, nor is it about two polar opposites, but however, as Samoa maintains its traditional protocols, but still wanting to become modern, how does that look within studying religion or Christianity? Another point that I mentioned is that culture informs Christianity and vice versa. Another point here is religion exists alongside modernization and globalizing processes. I think it is false to claim that every Samoan wants to stay back in the 1830s. No, modernization and globalization is real. Cultures are active, cultures are dynamic, and I think, and it's a fact actually, that Samoa is moving forward, but still they're wanting to hold on to these traditions, but it's actually, the main of that tradition is Christianity. The Samoan saying says, "E fofo ele ala mea le ala mea," and this is actually a conclusion to this particular presentation, that it basically states that you can deal with issues within your own family and with your own communities. And that is how Samoa actually dealt with this particular issue in 2021. And at the top of all of the discussions is, where does God play a role in this? not only at the village level, at the community level, at the religious discussions, and even those who are providing foreign aid, they realize that you have to have that discussions about Christianity in Samoa's context in order to deal with developments. And for lau marfatu to Faftaila. Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks, Brian. So hopefully we'll see you popping up on the screen because we'll now look to take some questions from the audience. So the great thing is we've got about 10 minutes and we've got the mic here, and then so, we'll just look, So if you could just say your name and where you're from, and then,
Thanks. Sefa from the University of the South Pacific. I would like to say thank you for the wonderful presentation. I see it as a different dimension. Indigenous people in developed country and indigenous people in developing countries. There are two different aspects of how you deal with the indigenous issue. A question to Walt from Solomon Island. You mentioned that 70% of the land is owned by customary owners and 80% is owned by community. Then you also mentioned that development should not focus on the 30, but also on the 70% of the population. How do you balance customary land owners that forbids private ownership, is a barrier to investment, and to the 30% of the population? How would you balance that? You know?
I might get you to pop up here to
Thank you.
just so anyone virtual can hear your response to this question.
Okay, thank you very much, Vinaka, for that question. Yeah, I think that 30% is owned by not communities, but the government. Those are called alienated lands, I think you will know. And 70% is owned by the tribes. And in fact, they do not really forbid development, but the only thing is that they can choose whatever development they want. And when there are no other opportunities, they resort to development such as logging, which is destructive for them. But then I think that's a very good question, and we're still looking for answers for it. But from my perspective, I would say that I think the only way to balance the development will be to provide economic opportunities to those in the 70%. I think I didn't have the time to really explain about the overall structure of the Solomons. With the 70% in the rural areas, most of them do not have access to good schools. Some of the students still have to paddle to schools because schools are far away, and even health centers and so forth. And even they do not have opportunities, like there are lack of roads, which means some in the communities, they do not access markets, which if market is available, they can sell the everyday products. Yeah? And then it makes it worse when the country is like dispersed, yeah? Different islands, and then the development is just focusing on Guadalcanal Island. And that is one of the big problems. So I think if those opportunities, if it's to go down to 70%, and it's not anyone's fault, I think the government has to really be serious on looking on that, rather than focusing on other ways. Yeah, so it's getting the public service down to the 70%, getting the roads down to the 70%. And I think most of the donors and NGOs may commit the same sin as well when they come. They focus on the 30% and they forget about the 70%. So you could that's what in my PhD thesis I called paper-based reforms. So much of the reforms are written, colorful, they present it to the government, and it stays in the 30% and gathers dust from themselves. but then they forget about the 70% who own the lands and who develop there. Yeah, I think that's how best I can answer.
Great, thanks for that, Jerry. So I might see if there's a question in the audience for Brian, because, you know, with the three of us here in person, we can be kind of cornered in the tea room, but in the tea space. But has anyone got a question that? Great, yeah.
Talofa, Brian, thank you so much for your presentation. Nina Tui with Caritas Aotearoa. So I was really interested to hear about how you described Christianity and development and not being two separate spheres, but that these are, you know, working alongside together. And I suppose in the New Zealand context, faith-based NGOs might sit in an interesting juxtaposition between those two spaces. So I would be interested to hear your views on faith-based international NGOs.
Yeah, the faith-based international NGOs in Samoa, it becomes the ongoing question about foreign aid. And many of the organizations here, they work closely with the government. And it's actually many of the faith-based organizations that are dealing with many of the issues, social issues of Samoa. And so, like I said, I've just transitioned to development studies, and this is more ongoing research that needs to be done. But from what I've seen and from what I've read so far, faith-based organizations have been basically at the top of assistance to the government of Samoa, and they are heavily relied on, mainly because they do have the same viewpoints or theological viewpoints on how to deal with issues and care for human, or more of a human approach, I guess, if that makes any sense.
So is there anyone else that might have a question for Brian as well? Or I'll just, I might just see if there's anyone else in the audience that might have a question. Yeah, just here. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. Just a short comment, Brian. Talofa lava. Mamlitia from Tonga and studying at Massey University. I just want to say that there was another paper from Papua New Guinea today based on Christian values that sustain development. So, you know, it just complements your paper. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so there were some other hands up there, and if not, I'll go back to who had their hand up here before. So before we move to anyone else with a question? For anyone, sorry, for anyone. Yeah, sorry, anyone, yeah.
Thank you very much. Great presentations all around. Jerry, my question is for you. You started your presentation with the case of the Sirebe community, which seems like it's a case where a conservation initiative has not failed. In fact, it's been successful. And I'm curious about payment for ecosystem services as a possibility for development in Solomon Islands. And I wonder if you can tell us, you talked about the reasons why conservation initiatives fail, but I wonder what we can learn from cases of success. Is Sirebe one of those? What can we see that contributes to success in those cases? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, in terms of that community, I think there was in 2010 they passed a Protected Area Act, the government, and so there are very stringent measures on how you can achieve that status, and it took them 10 years to achieve those status. And when we went around during the study, some even joked that it's easier to go for logging than to fulfill the requirements for the Protected Area Act. But yes, sorry, you were saying the payments? I didn't quite get that part.
So you talked about that community receiving, I think you said $1 million a year from now on.
Yes.
Through carbon capture, I imagine. But I think, carbon capture through forestation, through protection of marine resources. I wonder and I hope that there may be possibilities there in terms of payment for conservation and through international markets that might start to result resolve that question of economic opportunity in the 70% and so on.
Sure. Yes. I'll take that as a comment. Okay, thank you so much.
Any other questions? So we've got one just here, and we've got a couple of minutes, so.
Oh, thank you. Jane from Manaaki Whenua, Land Care Research, and following on from the logging question, I was talking to a colleague who worked in Toitu, that's a subsidiary owned by Manaaki Whenua, before they went off to Egypt and they were in the Pacific Pavilion. And I was asking this question about, the carbon sequestration, how close are we really to real money being handed over to communities who don't log their forests and so forth. And she, who knows so much more about this, and I wish she was here to answer this or talk about it, but she said it is a phenomenally complex administrative burden on these communities, and there's a huge cost involved in registering your land for these payments, and it can be up to 300,000 New Zealand dollars or US dollars to even register. So I think when we're all thinking about these lovely mechanisms for we won't log, we'll keep the trees and we'll have a few bees and a few other things, we've got to be really pragmatic about the journey for these communities and those people who represent them through the myriad of NGOs and regional agencies, that this, is not the easy solution. It should be a better solution, but I just take my hat off to anybody who's working in that space because I think it is really complex. And maybe with the will and might of donor coordination, we can lobby those international markets to make it easier for the Pacific countries in particular. Thank you.
Okay, so we might have just one last question and we'll go to tea if someone's got a question. If not, we'll look to, round of applause for me and my colleagues. All right, thanks for joining us, Brian, and we look forward to having a Massey Development Studies trip to Apia soon.
Yes, please join us. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, guys, tea time. Yeah, I know, right? What? Session.